The grand choosing ceremony of Arendor was supposed to be the culmination of a lifetime of quiet devotion. Instead, it became the moment Seren Vantrell's entire world shattered. She knelt on the unforgiving granite floor of the high altar, her head bowed in the traditional posture of an Omega awaiting her Alpha. The cavernous space of the moon temple of Arendor was wrapped in heavy, suffocating silence and the crushing weight of ancient stone. Above her, massive pillars reached up into the shadows, their surfaces rough and imposing. The coarse rock pressed against her bare knees through the thin, ceremonial white fabric of her gown. But Seren barely registered the physical discomfort. A different kind of intensity consumed her entirely. The fated mate bond, a tangible, invisible tether connecting her soul to the ruler of this pack, throbbed at the base of her throat with a frantic, pulsing rhythm. Before her stood Cedric Ironwood, the ancient high priest of the pack. His gnarled hands, trembling slightly from the sheer weight of the ancestral magic in the room, held a heavy silver chalice of consecrated water. The scent of burning beeswax and crushed pine needles filled the stagnant air, thick with the weight of tradition. Hundreds of elite pack members stood in the gallery behind her, their breath caught in the tense stillness, waiting in hushed anticipation to witness the sealing of their sovereign's bond. The oppressive weight of their collective stares pressed down on her shoulders. Seren kept her storm-grey eyes fixed firmly on the intricate geometric carvings of the altar stone, refusing to let them see her tremble. She was an Omega, the lowest rank within the rigid hierarchy of Arendor. She had spent her entire life invisible, a quiet servant who mended torn garments and gathered herbs in the woods, keeping her head down to survive the brutal politics of the court. She had learned early that survival meant blending into the shadows. But beneath her ribs, buried so deep that no tracker or seer had ever detected it, a secret warmth lay dormant. It was the solar spark core, an ancient, golden manifestation of a forgotten Sunborn lineage, a divine fire that she had painstakingly suppressed to fit into the aggressive world of wolves. Only the Alpha King had ever made her feel safe enough to hope that one day she might let that hidden golden light bleed through the cracks of her carefully constructed facade. For months they had met in secret, bound by the undeniable, intoxicating pull of the moon's decree. He had whispered promises into her hair in the dark, his massive frame shielding her from the harshness of his own kingdom. She had trusted him implicitly. The heavy iron-bound oak doors at the far end of the temple groaned open, the sound echoing like a thunderclap across the vaulted ceilings. A sudden draught swept through the sanctuary, instantly extinguishing a dozen pale blue candles lining the aisle. Seren's heart leapt into her throat. Her crescent-claiming mark, a faint silver scar hidden beneath the long sleeve of her gown, began to burn with a fierce, searing heat. He was here. Draven Thornwood, the Alpha King of Arendor, commander of the Southern Territories, the man who held her fragile, beating heart in his callous hands. She turned her head slightly, unable to resist the primal urge to look upon her fated mate. Draven moved down the center aisle, with the terrifying, absolute authority of a predator. He was a massive, imposing figure wrapped in dark furs and boiled leather, his winter storm eyes fixed straight ahead, the raw, animalistic aura of his power pressed down on the room, heavy enough to make the lesser wolves in the gallery drop their gazes in instant submission. But the searing heat of Seren's claiming mark suddenly faltered, violently twisting into a hollow, sickening ache. Draven was not walking alone. The scent hit her first. It was not the familiar, comforting aroma of deep woods and clean earth that always accompanied the Alpha King. It was a sweet, cloying wave of heavily perfumed gardenia, a scent so artificial and overpowering that it barely masked the underlying rot of ruthless ambition. Clinging tightly to Draven's muscular forearm was Maria Vance. The high-born noblewoman moved with a practiced, feline grace, her exquisite crimson silk gown a stark, violent contrast against the bleak grey stone of the temple. Her chin was tipped upward, Her lips curved into a sweet, toxic smile that promised absolute devastation. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the sacred sanctuary of Arundor. The murmurs of the pack elite died instantly, replaced by the collective, breathless tension of a kingdom witnessing a public execution. Cedric Ironwood lowered the silver chalice, his ancient eyes widening in shock as he looked from the kneeling Omega at the altar to the Alpha King, striding forward with another woman on his arm. Seren's breath hitched. The golden warmth of her dormant Sunborn core, buried in her chest, recoiled, violently clashing against the sudden influx of panic. The fated bond tethering her to Draven did not just ache. It began to splinter, like ice forming a fault line that would hold until pressure found its weakness. She watched, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, as Draven stopped at the base of the altar steps. He did not look at her. His winter storm eyes remained locked on the stone wall behind the high priest, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line. Maria squeezed his arm, her honeyed perfume choking the sacred air. The noblewoman cast a fleeting, triumphant glance down at the kneeling girl, her eyes glittering with the clinical satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered a wounded doe. Seren felt a creeping numbness spread through her veins, a stark emptiness settling permanently into her bones the exact moment her alpha refused to meet her gaze. The ancient priest found his voice, though it cracked under the immense pressure of Draven's dark aura. Cedric's hands shook as he gripped the edges of the altar. "My king," the old man stammered, his gaze darting nervously toward the crimson-clad mistress. "The sacred rites demand the presence of the true fated mate. The moon has already chosen the Omega. You cannot alter the ancestral decree." Draven's expression darkened into a mask of pure, unfeeling stone, his posture rigid and uncompromising. He reached into the heavy folds of his dark cloak, his gloved fingers withdrawing a small ancient object. It was the moon ring, the sacred silver band, forged centuries ago to represent the unbreakable union of the Southern Kingdom's sovereign rulers, caught the faint, pale light of the braziers. It was the ring that belonged on Seren's finger, the ring he had promised to place there when they lay tangled in the dark just 3 nights ago, when he had sworn that her low status meant nothing compared to the demands of their fated souls. Before the ancestors and the moon, Draven announced, his voice echoing through the stunned silence, "I reject Seren of the Vantrell line as my mate and Luna of this pack. In her place," he continued, not even glancing at her, "I claim Maria Vance as my true mate." The words did not just echo, they struck with the physical, concussive force of a battlefield blow. The fated bond deep inside Seren's chest snapped. It was a visceral, agonizing tear, a violent severing of the soul that felt as though a jagged blade of obsidian had been driven directly through her sternum. She gasped silently, her hands flying to her stomach as her body folded inward against the blinding, suffocating pain. The crescent claiming mark on her wrist, once a source of secret, searing warmth, instantly turned dead and hollow. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, she realized through the haze of agony. It creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. The connection that had grounded her to the world, to the pack, to the very earth beneath her feet, was brutally and cleanly excised. Draven opened his hand. He did not hand the sacred band to the high priest. He simply let it fall. The moon ring hit the granite steps with a sharp, metallic clatter. It bounced twice, the sound deafening in the absolute silence of the temple, before coming to rest directly at Seren's trembling knees. "My kingdom requires a Luna of true strength," Draven stated flatly, his voice devoid of any warmth, any memory of the secret nights they had shared. "Arundor cannot be ruled by a defective, wolfless Omega who cowers in the shadows. The Thornwood line requires power. Maria brings an alliance with the eastern borders, a purebred lineage, and a wolf capable of standing beside me in battle. The ancestors understand the necessity of strength over sentiment." Maria stepped forward, her crimson skirts brushing against the silver ring discarded on the floor. She smiled down at the kneeling girl, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "You understand, don't you, little Omega?" the noblewoman murmured, her tone perfectly calculated to carry to the front rows of the elite gallery. "It is a matter of duty. A kingdom cannot survive on the weak shoulders of a servant. You should return to the kitchens. It is where you belong." The court waited. They waited for the inevitable breakdown. They expected the discarded bride to throw herself over the stone, to weep hysterically, to clutch at the Alpha King's heavy boots and beg for her rightful place. They expected the messy, desperate display of a low-status creature stripped of her only chance at elevation. She did not complain. She did not beg. She did not shed a single, pathetic tear for the man who had just butchered her soul for political convenience. Seren slowly pushed herself up from the floor. Her limbs felt heavy, leaden with the profound shock of the severed bond, but beneath the agonizing emptiness of the rejection, the dormant golden fire of her hidden solar magic began to flare. It did not rise in a destructive inferno. It rose in a quiet, stabilizing pulse, flooding her shattered nervous system with a deep, ancient heat. It reinforced her spine, steadying her trembling knees and lifting her chin. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, her storm-grey eyes finally rising to meet Draven's. For a fraction of a second, the stone-cold facade of the Alpha King faltered. A microscopic tremor crossed Draven's jaw as he met her gaze. He had expected devastation. He had braced himself for her weeping, arming his conscience with political justifications. Instead, he found himself staring into a vast, terrifyingly calm abyss. There was no love left in her eyes. There was no hatred. There was only the desolate, chilling emptiness of a room that had been permanently vacated. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with, Seren thought, the quiet realization settling over her like a protective mantle. Moving with a slow, deliberate grace that completely defied her Omega status, she reached up to her own throat. Her fingers, calloused from years of unacknowledged labor, found the delicate silver clasp of her ceremonial necklace. She unfastened it without a tremor. She stepped over the moon ring, still lying on the floor, ignoring it entirely as she walked up the final step to the high altar. Cedric stepped back, his ancient eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound grief as the quiet girl placed her own silver token gently beside the sacred chalice. The metallic clink of her necklace hitting the stone was the only sound in the vast, echoing cathedral. Seren turned her back on the altar. She turned her back on the high priest, on the crimson-clad mistress, and on the massive, imposing Alpha King who had just thrown her away. The crowd parted automatically as she began to walk. She was wrapped in a quiet, untouchable sovereignty that none of them could comprehend. She was halfway down the cavernous center aisle, her unblemished hands hanging loosely at her sides, when the heavy, iron-bound oak doors of the temple did not simply groan open again. They exploded. A deafening, concussive boom rocked the ancient foundations of the Moon Temple. Massive shards of black oak, twisted metal hinges, and jagged iron bolts rained across the granite floor, scattering the front rows of the elite gallery. A violent, shrieking blizzard tore directly into the sanctuary, instantly extinguishing every remaining brazier in a choking cloud of grey smoke. The screaming winds did not just carry the bitter bite of Arendor's winter. They carried the lethal, absolute zero of the true northern wastes, a primordial freeze that instantly commanded the respect of every living creature in the room. And stepping through the ruined archway was a silhouette carved from absolute nightmare. It was Kalin Valerius, the Rival Lycan King, sovereign of the Frost Citadel, commander of the northern hordes, and the most universally feared beast across 3 realms. He was a colossal, imposing figure wrapped in heavy obsidian furs, his broad shoulders dusting with fresh, pristine snow. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his alpha aura slammed into the enclosed space. It was a crushing physical weight that instantly drove the elite Arendor warriors to their knees. their wolves whimpering in sudden, helpless submission. Draven staggered at the high altar, his hand flying to the hilt of his ceremonial blade. "What is the meaning of this, Valerius?" the Southern King roared, his voice booming over the howling wind, though a distinct primal tremor of fear laced his command. Draven stepped forward, desperately trying to project his own dominance. "You trespass in a sacred right. State your business or face the wrath of my pack." Kalin did not stop. He did not slow his measured, earth-shaking strides, and most insultingly, he did not even look at the Alpha King of Arundor. Kalin dismissed Draven completely, treating the southern ruler with the absolute apathy one might reserve for a buzzing insect. Kalin's gaze, swirling with the violence of a winter tempest, was fixed entirely on the fragile, white-clad Omega standing alone in the center of the shattered isle. As Kalin closed the distance, his terrifying gaze locked with Seren's, and the violent storm in his eyes abruptly shifted, melting into a deep, burning, molten gold. He breathed in the frozen air. He did not smell a defective, wolfless servant. Beneath the scent of her despair, he caught the unmistakable, divine fragrance of wild honey, crushed amber, and ancient solar fire. He recognized exactly what she was, and exactly what she was worth. Kalin stopped directly in front of her. The contrast between them was staggering, the massive, lethal king dripping with melted snow, and the quiet, abandoned girl in a thin, shivering gown. The entire court held its collective breath, terrified that the beast of the north was about to strike her down for blocking his path. Instead, Kalin Valerius, the untouchable sovereign who had never bowed to any god or monarch, dropped heavily to one knee on the freezing stone. A collective, suffocated gasp echoed through the dark temple. Up on the altar, Cedric clutched the silver chalice to his chest, his ancient knees giving out entirely as he collapsed in sheer, unadulterated shock. "You are freezing, little light," Kalin murmured, his voice a low, cavernous rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and traveled straight into Seren's aching chest. He reached out with massive, battle-scarred hands, his fingers trembling slightly as they gently, reverently enveloped her cold, calloused palms. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark, violent contrast to the reputation of the monster who knelt before her. He reached into the heavy folds of his obsidian cloak. He did not withdraw a flimsy silver band. Between his thick fingers rested the obsidian crest ring. It was a massive, ancient artifact, forged from volcanic glass and raw northern magic. It was the physical manifestation of supreme sovereignty over the largest kingdom in the world, and it thrummed with a heavy protective power that directly answered the void left in her chest. "Arundor is too cold for the sun," Kalin declared, his voice carrying effortlessly over the howling wind to every corner of the silent sanctuary. He looked up at her, stripping away all of his terrifying northern defenses, leaving only raw, transparent devotion in his golden eyes. "Let me take you home. Let me give you the throne you were born to rule." Seren stared down at the fearsome king, her piercing grey gaze wide. She did not pull away. With a quiet, steady breath, she allowed Kalin to slide the massive volcanic band onto her trembling finger. The exact moment the volcanic glass settled against her skin, the dormant solar spark core buried deep beneath her ribs erupted. It was not a destructive inferno, but a blinding, beautiful flare of golden restorative heat. A wave of shimmering, honeyed light pulsed outward from her body, instantly melting the frost on her thin gown and thawing the ice covering the nearest pillars. The excruciating, hollow ache in her marrow vanished, replaced by the profound, overwhelming warmth of true, undeniable safety. Behind them, at the base of the altar, Draven Thornwood collapsed. A horrific, guttural sound of pure, unmitigated, emotional agony tore from the Southern King's throat. The severed fated mate bond inside Draven's chest did not just ache. It violently, cosmically backfired. The moon's true decree, enraged by his arrogant rejection, slammed the full weight of its punishment into him the instant the northern sovereign claimed his discarded mate. the searing heat of Draven's own claiming mark instantly inverted, turning into a profound, suffocating emptiness that brought him to his knees on the granite steps. He clutched frantically at his own chest, as if his lungs were collapsing under the crushing weight of his colossal mistake. He was choking on the spiritual void of his severed bond. The sickening realization hit Draven with the physical force of a collapsing mountain. Through the haze of his blinding regret, he saw the radiant, golden light spilling from the fragile girl he had just thrown away. He had not discarded a weak, defective Omega. He had just handed the legendary Sunborn savior of his entire kingdom directly into the hands of his greatest, most powerful enemy. Maria shrieked in mindless panic, stumbling backward and tripping over her own exquisite crimson silk. Draven gasped for air on the pristine white steps, and the high-born mistress scrambled away from the broken Alpha, her toxic ambitions shattering into pathetic terror as the reality of what they had lost set in. But Seren did not look back at the altar. She did not spare a single glance for the screaming Alpha who had discarded her soul for political convenience, nor the terrified mistress who had sought to replace her. Kalin rose to his full, imposing height. He stripped his heavy, fur-lined cloak from his broad shoulders and wrapped it gently around Seren's fragile frame, cocooning her in absolute, impenetrable protection and the intoxicating scent of dark pine. Before anyone in the paralyzed court could draw a breath, the rival Lycan King swept the tiny, glowing Omega into his massive arms, holding her securely against his armored chest. "She is the true Luna of the Northern Wastes," Kalin's voice thundered, vibrating with a deadly, possessive finality that promised absolute war to anyone who dared question him. "If any wolf of Arundor takes a single step toward her, I will bury this entire kingdom in ice." He turned, cradling her against his racing heart, and carried her out through the shattered doors, stepping boldly into the blinding white fury of the winter storm. Seren closed her eyes, burying her face in the warm, dark fur of his collar. "Thank you for letting me go," she thought, the last lingering thread of her old life severing completely. Because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. The world outside the ruined sanctuary of the Moon Temple was a blinding, shrieking expanse of unforgiving white. Kalin Valerius did not flinch against the bitter, biting wind that tore across the high mountain pass. He moved with the terrifying, absolute certainty of an apex predator returning to his rightful domain, carrying Satis effortlessly against his heavy, frost-crusted obsidian furs. The sheer, crushing magnitude of his alpha aura rolled off his massive frame in thick, suffocating waves, creating an invisible, impenetrable barrier against the howling winter storm. The biting cold could not reach her bare skin. She was completely cocooned in the deep, intoxicating scent of wild honey, crushed pine needles, and the primordial, lethal frost of the northern wastes. Behind them, the elite guards of Arundor remained entirely paralyzed on the cracked granite steps of the cathedral. They were wolves who prided themselves on their aggressive southern ferocity, warriors who had mocked her low status for years, yet none of them dared to take a single step forward. The raw, animalistic dominance radiating from the monstrous Alpha had driven their wolves into absolute, whimpering submission. They could only watch in silent, helpless terror as the fearsome beast of the north carried away the discarded Omega they had deemed unworthy of a crown. Waiting at the base of the treacherous cliff path was a colossal northern war carriage, a terrifying construct forged from blackened iron and dark, heavily reinforced oak. It was a vehicle designed to survive the absolute zero of the frozen wastelands, etched with ancient glowing silver runes of the frost citadel that pulsed with a steady, protective resonance. The massive transport was pulled by 4 enormous silver-furred direwolves whose eyes burned with feral, intelligent gold. The beasts snarled violently at the lingering scent of the southern pack in the air. Their massive jaws snapped wildly at the falling snow, but they instantly dropped their heavy heads in complete, reverent submission the moment Kalin approached. He did not hand her over to a waiting guard. He did not order a servant to assist the fragile Omega. Kalin Valerius, the untouchable sovereign who had slaughtered entire armies without a second thought, reached out with one battle-scarred, heavily armored hand and pulled open the thick iron door of the carriage himself. He set her gently onto the plush, velvet-lined bench inside the cabin, his movements agonizingly precise and slow. He handled her as if she were the most delicate, sacred vessel in existence, completely contradicting every horrific rumor she had ever heard about his cruelty. The interior of the carriage was a sudden, sensory sanctuary, providing a stark, violent contrast to the bleak, hostile grey stone of the temple they had just left behind. It was impossibly warm, insulated by thick layers of dark direwolf pelts and heated by a small, enclosed hearth forged from enchanted volcanic rock that cast a soft, flickering amber glow across the enclosed space. Kalin climbed into the cabin behind her, his massive shoulders taking up a tremendous amount of space. The heavy iron door slammed shut, sealing them in a private, dim world. The thick metal immediately cut off the shrieking howl of the Arendor blizzard. Seren expected him to crowd her. She had spent her entire life surviving in a rigid southern pack where dominant alphas constantly asserted their power through physical intimidation, taking up space and demanding absolute submission from the lower ranks. But Kalin did not sit beside her. He deliberately lowered his colossal frame onto the opposite bench, pressing his broad back firmly against the far wall to give her as much physical distance as the enclosed cabin allowed. He began to slowly pull off his heavy, snow-crusted leather gloves, his storm-grey eyes fixed entirely on his own hands. He was intentionally giving her room to breathe. He was giving her the choice to look at him or to shrink away. Seren sat completely frozen, her unblemished, calloused hands resting rigidly on her knees. Her mind was a chaotic, spinning vortex of residual adrenaline and profound emotional shock. It was still entirely incomprehensible to her fragile, shattered nervous system. In her mind's eye, the scene played out in a vivid, continuous loop of present-tense terror. The temple doors are shattered as the powerful rival Lycan King, Kalin Valerius, marches inside, his terrifying dark wolf aura immediately silencing the mocking court. She had braced herself for death. She had expected the monster of the north to slaughter everyone in the room, herself included. But the hallucination of memory continued with crystal, undeniable clarity, replaying the exact, surreal second Kalin Valerius approaches Seren Vantrell, recognizes her rare Sunborn lineage, and places his dark obsidian seal ring on her finger, declaring her his empress before the stunned assembly. She stared down at her trembling left hand. The heavy, dark weight of the obsidian crest ring felt strangely, beautifully warm against her pale skin. It was a physical, undeniable anchor tethering her to this new, impossible reality, proving that the supreme status reversal she had just experienced was not a dying dream. A sudden, sharp tremor racked her small, fragile frame. It was not the biting cold of the winter storm. It was the devastating, metaphysical whiplash of the severed fated mate bond. Seren reached up with her right hand, her fingertips brushing against the long sleeve of her white ceremonial gown, tracing the exact spot on her wrist where her crescent claiming mark used to be. It was entirely dead. The searing, hopeful heat that had once tied her soul to Draven Thornwood was permanently gone, replaced by a smooth, numb, and hollow scar. In the quiet darkness of the moving carriage, she felt a sudden, sickening phantom ache, a distant, desperate, somatic echo of Draven's pure, unmitigated emotional agony. The Southern King was drowning in the spiritual void of his own colossal mistake, and the dying tether tried to pull her down into his despair. But before the cold, suffocating emptiness could consume her, the dormant golden fire buried deep beneath her ribs flared in absolute righteous defiance. The solar spark core, the ancient, divine manifestation of her forgotten Sunborn lineage, began to pulse with a steady, rhythmic throb. It was a profound, overwhelming warmth that flooded her shattered nervous system, actively fighting the chill of Draven's rejection. A faint, shimmering golden light began to glow just beneath the surface of her skin, wrapping her in a layer of ancient, cosmic protection. The crimson-clad mistress had smirked, assuming the silent servant would simply fade away and die in the snow. She was wrong. Because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. Kalin watched her carefully from across the dim cabin. His sharp, storm-grey eyes missed nothing. He saw the violent tremor in her slender shoulders, the way her small fingers dug into the velvet cushions, and the way the beautiful honeyed light of her magic flickered, fighting to stabilize her breaking heart. He did not speak immediately. He allowed her the dignity of processing her grief without demanding her attention, projecting only a quiet, steady wave of absolute safety across the small space. "You are safe, Seren," Kalin finally murmured. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated pleasantly through the solid oak floorboards and traveled straight into her aching chest. He used her actual name. He did not use a derogatory pack rank. He did not call her an omega, a servant or a political asset. He spoke her name with a deep, earnest reverence that sounded like a sacred prayer in the ancient tongue. He reached onto the bench beside him, his massive hands picking up a heavy, fur-lined blanket. He did not toss it to her carelessly. Kalin leaned forward slowly, broadcasting his movement so she would not flinch in panic, and gently draped the thick, dark direwolf pelts over her trembling shoulders. The physical weight of the furs, combined with the intoxicating scent of wild pine and deep winter frost, enveloped her completely, instantly calming the frantic, erratic beating of her heart. "Why?" Seren whispered, her voice hoarse, cracking painfully from the sheer emotional exhaustion of maintaining her absolute silence on the altar. She clutched the edges of the dark fur, her storm-grey eyes rising to meet his. "I am an outcast, a rejected servant with a defective wolf. Why did you come for me?" Kalin paused, his battle-scarred hands resting heavily on his armored knees. His eyes, the true primal mark of his terrifying wolf, shifted in the dim, flickering light of the carriage hearth, melting from a violent storm grey into a deep, burning molten gold. "Because the world has been too cold for too long," he replied flatly, his tone completely stripped of all political pretense or royal arrogance. "I have tracked the scent of ancient solar fire for years across 3 realms. I knew the Sunborn lineage had not been completely extinguished, but the southern pack kept you buried in the dark kitchens." He reached into a small compartment beneath his seat, withdrawing a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and offered it to her. "Drink. It is spiced, honeyed wine. It will warm the blood the cold tried to steal." Seren took the flask with shaking fingers. The liquid burned pleasantly down her throat, a stark sensory contrast to the freezing winter frost outside the carriage walls. "They did not see you, little light," Kalin continued, his jaw tightening, a lethal, terrifying possessiveness bleeding into his low voice. "They only saw what they could exploit. We are small things in a world of teeth, my Seren. Smallness is a gift. Use it. Your quietness, your ability to endure while they boasted and schemed, is exactly why your divine magic survived their corruption." Kalin leaned back against the dark wood, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, protective stone as he thought of the Southern King, who had dared to publicly humiliate her. The exact moment he cast that silver ring to the floor, the moment he severed your ancestral tether, the magic of the world violently shifted. I felt the void open. I felt your beautiful fire screaming in the dark. His golden eyes locked onto hers, blazing with absolute, uncompromised devotion. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. The physical proximity of the rival Lycan King was supposed to be a death sentence. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered in the shadows of the southern keep. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime, looking at the massive, scarred king who had just stripped off his own emotional armor to wrap a shivering, rejected Omega in warmth. Seren realized the rumors were entirely wrong. "I will not demand anything of you," Kalin vowed, his voice softening, the violent storm in his aura melting entirely into deep, burning reverence. "You are not a political pawn to be traded for border alliances. You are not a prisoner of the Frost Citadel. I have placed the obsidian crest ring on your finger to ensure that no wolf in any kingdom will ever dare to disrespect you or lower their eyes in your presence again. But I will not claim your soul until you offer it freely. I will earn your trust every single day. I will earn the right to stand beside you." The profound sincerity of his vow hung in the warm, cedar-scented air. He was a king who commanded tens of thousands of feral warriors. He was a man who had conquered entire continents with brutal efficiency, yet he was explicitly, voluntarily yielding his sovereign authority to a girl who had spent her morning scrubbing ash from a cold stone hearth. It was an equal partnership where safety, transparency, and personal choice were guaranteed. As the massive carriage tore deeper into the frozen, treacherous wilderness, the brutal storm outside raged against the reinforced iron walls. The winds shrieked like dying phantoms across the glass. But inside the private sanctuary, a miraculous, quiet shift occurred. The passive, radiant heat of her inner celestial spark began to completely fill the small space. It was a shimmering, honeyed light that utterly defied the bitter, biting winter. Kalin looked down at his own chest, the thick, perpetual layers of magical frost that always clung to his heavy obsidian armor, a painful, isolating byproduct of his own volatile, lethal northern magic, were actually beginning to melt. Tiny, clear droplets of water ran down the dark metal, pooling harmlessly on the floorboards. For decades, his body had been trapped in a state of absolute, agonizing zero, a curse that punished anyone who dared to touch him. But in her radiant presence, the ancient ice was finally breaking. Seren watched the frost melt away from his battle-scarred armor. Her heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming surge of protective instinct. Without thinking, driven by a deep, somatic urge she had suppressed her entire life, she reached out across the small space between them. Her small, unblemished hand, glowing faintly with divine, golden warmth, gently touched the edge of his freezing leather gauntlet. Kalin inhaled sharply, his massive chest rising rapidly as the searing, restorative heat of her skin connected with his frozen magic. The physical shock of fire meeting ice sent a powerful healing resonance through the cabin. He did not pull away. He did not flinch. He simply closed his golden eyes, leaning imperceptibly into her warm touch, slowly exhaling a breath he felt he had been holding for centuries. Wrapped in his dark, heavy furs, Seren allowed her tense muscles to finally relax. She was lulled by the steady, grinding rhythm of the carriage wheels and the protective, thundering thud of the Alpha King's heart. She slowly closed her own exhausted eyes. The winter storm howled furiously outside, desperate and cold, but inside the Iron Sanctuary, the true Empress of the North finally allowed herself to rest, knowing she had found a home that would never, ever cast her out. The colossal northern war carriage had already disappeared into the blinding white fury of the blizzard, but inside the ruined sanctuary of the Moon Temple, the true devastation was only just beginning. Draven Thornwood remained on his knees at the base of the high altar, his massive hands clawing desperately at the cracked granite steps. The initial shock of the northern warlord's violent intrusion had completely paralyzed the southern court. But as the physical distance between the Alpha King and his discarded mate increased with every powerful revolution of the carriage wheels, the agonizing reality of the severed fated mate bond escalated into a terminal, somatic crisis. The invisible, cosmic tether that had once bound his soul to Seren Vantrell did not simply break. It was being slowly, brutally uprooted from the deepest foundations of his spirit. Every mile Kalin carried her northward was a jagged blade, dragging directly through Draven's nervous system, tearing apart the magical infrastructure he had arrogantly taken for granted. The southern sovereign gasped for air, his broad shoulders heaving violently as an unnatural, terrifying chill flooded his veins. He tore frantically at the collar of his boiled leather tunic, exposing the skin of his wrist where a faint, phantom warmth had always resided since the day the moon paired them. It was completely gone. In its place, a creeping, necrotic cold began to spread, turning the veins beneath his skin a sickly bruised violet. The severed mark on his wrist didn't just drain his strength. It created a catastrophic void, an agonizing absence where his alpha magic had once thrived. The realization slammed into him with the physical concussive force of a collapsing mountain. The empty space left behind by her rejected soul was actively consuming his own alpha strength, devouring his vitality to feed the agonizing emptiness of the cosmic backlash. The pain was not a metaphor. It was a devastating, systemic organ failure of the soul. He clutched his chest, his sharp, claw-like nails biting into his own flesh, as a burning sensation tore through his respiratory system, making him feel as though he were inhaling shattered glass with every desperate gasp. The necrosis spreading from Draven's wrist was completely unnatural, a horrifying reversal of the fated mate bond's intended purpose. Normally, a claiming mark pulsed with the shared vitality of two souls, a constant, reassuring heartbeat of mutual strength. Now the empty void on his skin acted like a black hole, aggressively pulling his body heat into the abyss. He watched in helpless terror as the dark, bruised veins traveled up his forearm, paralyzing his muscles and locking his joints in agonizing stiffness. His perfectly honed reflexes, the legendary combat speed that had won him the throne, were completely neutralized by the spiritual amputation. He was a king confined to the floor of his own temple, unable to even stand under the crushing weight of his colossal mistake. He tried to summon his alpha aura, to force the freezing room back into submission, but his inner well of magic was completely dry. His inner wolf, the ferocious beast that had commanded the southern territories with absolute, unquestioned authority, was entirely broken. It did not snarl in defiance. It did not fight the crippling pain. The massive, spiritual predator simply curled into the darkest corner of his mind and released a pitiful, dying howl of pure, unmitigated grief. The beast understood exactly what the arrogant king had refused to see. They had not just cast aside a quiet, low-status servant. They had butchered their own other half for the sake of a political alliance that now tasted like dry ash on his tongue. Above him, the ancient stones of the grand cathedral began to groan in sympathetic agony. A chilling, audible crack echoed through the cavernous space as a thick layer of primordial frost abruptly formed across the intricate geometric carvings of the high altar, creeping up the massive stone pillars like a rapid, deadly infection. Cedric Ironwood, still clutching the sacred silver chalice to his chest, watched in absolute horror as the holy water inside the vessel instantly froze solid. The high priest's ancient, trembling gaze shifted from the ruined cup to the trembling sovereign on the floor. The ambient, invisible warmth that had always protected Arendor from the harsh mountain winters was vanishing. It was being siphoned away, carried off into the deep northern wastes in the arms of their greatest, most lethal enemy. "You fool," Cedric whispered, his voice cracking under the immense weight of a doom he could now see clearly. The old man did not care about pack hierarchy or the immediate danger of insulting his unpredictable ruler. The ancestral magic was speaking directly through his terrified bones. "We praised your alpha strength for our prosperity, Draven, but it was never you. It was her. The solar spark core was anchoring the very climate of our kingdom, and you threw it to the snow." "You have doomed us all," Cedric continued, his voice echoing off the rapidly freezing walls. "The ancient texts warned us of the arrogance of alphas. We believed our military might was the source of our prosperity. We believed that the moon goddess favored the Thornwood line because of our pure blood fangs and our vast armies, but the goddess does not bless arrogance. She hides her greatest gifts in the lowest rooms, testing the hearts of kings. You were given the rarest vessel of magic in 3 realms, a woman whose very breath kept the ice at bay, and you treated her like a defective burden. The frost you feel now is not just a passing storm, Draven. It is the permanent, unforgiving winter of your own making, and it will not stop until Arundor is buried. The atmospheric shift within the cavernous cathedral was shockingly rapid and undeniably violent. The thick, suffocating silence of the paralyzed court was suddenly broken by the sharp, metallic ping of freezing water. The grand fonts at the entrance of the temple shattered simultaneously, the holy water expanding into jagged spikes of solid ice that sprayed across the floor. The heavy tapestries lining the high walls, woven with the proud crimson and silver crests of the southern pack, stiffened as a layer of hoarfrost rapidly consumed the fabric. The elite warriors in the gallery, men and women who had spent years mocking Seren's quiet nature, now wrapped their arms around themselves, their breath plumbing in thick, white clouds of sudden terror. They were experiencing the true, unmitigated wrath of the moon's punishment. The goddess did not strike them with lightning. She simply removed the sun, leaving them to the absolute, unforgiving mercy of the cold they had created in their own dark hearts. Maria Vance scrambled to her feet, her exquisite crimson silk gown torn and stained with dark soot from the shattered braziers. The high-born noblewoman was trembling violently, her sweet, toxic smile completely erased by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the disaster unfolding around her. She had orchestrated this exact moment for years, manipulating court politics, bribing elders, and whispering sweet poison into the king's ear to secure her place on the throne. But the supreme throne she had just sacrificed everything to win was actively freezing beneath her expensive leather boots. "Draven!" Maria stammered, her voice shrill and laced with pathetic, clawing panic. She reached out, her heavily perfumed hands grasping his shaking shoulder in a desperate attempt to assert her new position as Luna. "My king, stand up! You must show the pack your absolute strength. We do not need the defective Omega. We have the Eastern Alliance." A feral, deafening roar tore from Draven's throat. He struck her hand away with a vicious, unthinking backhand swing that sent the noblewoman sprawling across the freezing granite. The scent of cloying gardenia, which had once intoxicated him with grand promises of military power, now made his grieving wolf violently nauseous. It smelled like rot. It smelled like the undeniable death of his empire. He turned his face away from her pathetic whimpering, his winter storm eyes locking onto a small, dull object resting in the spreading frost, the moon ring. The sacred silver band lay exactly where he had dropped it, abandoned and entirely worthless. The image burned itself into his retinas, fusing inextricably with the psychological torture of what he had just witnessed. He was forced to relive the exact, humiliating second when the rival Alpha gently swept Seren into his arms and carried her out of the temple, leaving the ruined ceremony and a pale Draven behind. The agonizing memory of her quiet dignity was a blade twisting deeper into his chest. The Northern King had not struck a single physical blow against the Southern army, yet he had utterly destroyed them. Far beyond the ruined borders of the Southern Territory, the brutal winter storm continued to scream across the jagged peaks of the Frost Pass. The colossal war carriage tore relentlessly through the heavy snow, its iron-banded wheels crushing the ancient ice with rhythmic, unstoppable force. Inside the heavily insulated cabin, the atmosphere was a profound, surreal sanctuary of absolute peace. The violent sensory contrast between the shrieking blizzard outside and the warm, amber-lit stillness within perfectly mirrored the massive shift in destiny that had just occurred. The golden light from the carriage, hearth flickered against the heavy frost coating the windows, unable to penetrate the thick iron, but offering a gentle, radiant warmth to the survivors inside. Seren remained sound asleep on the plush velvet-lined bench, completely enveloped in the heavy, dark, dire wolf furs. The profound emotional exhaustion of the public betrayal, followed immediately by the shocking, supreme status reversal, had completely drained her fragile body. She lay curled on her side, her breathing slow and steady, her face finally free of the quiet, enduring anxiety that had defined her entire invisible existence in the southern pack. From the opposite bench, the northern sovereign sat in perfect, motionless silence. The massive, terrifying ruler of the northern stronghold did not take his storm-grey eyes off her. The faint scent of her golden warmth filled the carriage, slowly banishing the bone-deep chill he had carried for decades. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders with a deep, reverent intensity that contradicted every blood-soaked rumor ever whispered about his reign. He was a king who had buried 3 generations of traitors, a warlord who had survived assassination attempts, dark curses, and the relentless brutality of the northern elements. He was intimately familiar with the anatomy of pain and the necessity of absolute ruthlessness. But watching the delicate, exhausted girl sleeping on his carriage bench, he felt a completely unfamiliar sensation tightening his massive chest. It was a profound, terrifying vulnerability. He possessed the absolute certainty that if anything were to extinguish the fragile, honeyed light radiating from her skin, he would gladly let the rest of the world burn to ash in unrelenting retribution. Kalin remembered the sheer, blinding rage that had consumed his mind when his royal trackers finally located the last living descendant of the Sunborn lineage, only to report that she was being treated as a lowly, disposable kitchen servant by the arrogant southern king. He had crossed 3 territorial borders in a single night, driving his direwolves to the absolute brink of exhaustion, driven by a primal, roaring instinct that defied all political logic. He had crashed the mating ceremony, fully expecting to find a broken, weeping victim begging for her life on the cold stone. Instead, he had found a queen. He had watched Seren stand on the high altar, stripped of her dignity, her title, and her future, and accept the absolute destruction of her life with a quiet, tearless sovereignty that commanded more respect than any alpha roar he had ever heard. She had not shattered, and that quiet resilience was exactly why she was meant to rule the North. He looked down at his own battle-scarred hands, turning them slowly in the dim amber light. The perpetual, agonizing layers of magical frost that had encased his heavy obsidian armor since he first took the throne were completely gone. The thick leather was soft, dry, and comfortably warm, heated by the ambient, restorative magic radiating passively from the girl sleeping mere feet away. The ancient solar magic buried deep within her chest was not just stabilizing her own shattered nervous system, it was actively reaching out, naturally countering the lethal winter magic that had tormented him for a lifetime. Kalin slowly extended his hand, stopping exactly 2 inches from the edge of her dark fur blanket. He did not touch her. He had explicitly yielded his sovereign authority to her, swearing to earn her trust without demanding a soul claim, and he would not break that sacred promise by intruding on her vulnerable rest. In the carriage, Kalin allowed his gaze to drift to the heavy, dark weight of the ancient sovereign artifact resting securely on her left hand. It caught the flickering, amber glow of the enchanted hearth, the volcanic glass thrumming with a heavy, protective power. The ring had belonged to the first sovereign of the icy stronghold, an artifact forged in dragonfire and ancient blood magic. It carried the weight of 100 brutal winters, yet it yielded effortlessly to her light. It was not meant for a delicate Omega. It was meant to be worn by a warrior who could withstand the brutal politics of his land. Yet, seeing it on her slender, calloused finger felt more right than seeing it on any of his predecessors. The ring did not weigh her down. It seemed to resonate perfectly with the divine solar fire in her veins, creating a perfect, unbreakable equilibrium between his primordial darkness and her absolute light. It was the ultimate symbol of his protection, a silent declaration to the ancestors and all living realms that she was untouchable, sovereign, and entirely his equal. As the massive war carriage crossed the invisible ancient boundary line, separating the neutral territories from the deep northern wastes, a miraculous shift began to occur in the hostile environment outside. The violent, shrieking winds of the blizzard did not stop, but the nature of the cold subtly, beautifully altered. Wherever the heavy iron wheels struck the permafrost, the passive, divine resonance of her Sunborn lineage bled through the thick floorboards and into the frozen earth. Deep beneath the heavy layers of ancient ice, dormant seeds that had not felt the sun in centuries began to stir with sudden, vibrant life. A faint, impossible trail of tiny, glowing golden embers trailed behind the carriage, instantly melting the heavy snow and leaving brief, fleeting patches of thawed, fertile soil in their wake. The massive, unforgiving kingdom of the north was already answering to its new empress, long before she even opened her eyes to witness her own power. Outside, the massive stone spires of the Frost Citadel finally began to materialize through the swirling white mist. The ancient fortress, carved directly into the side of a colossal glacial mountain, loomed over the valley like a sleeping giant. It was a place of harsh, jagged beauty and unforgiving strength, a sanctuary built for monsters who had long ago forgotten how to trust. But as the war carriage approached the towering outer gates, the heavy iron torches lining the massive walls, which had burned with cold blue magical flames for centuries, suddenly flickered. Without a single command from the guards, the flames shifted in absolute, perfect unison into a brilliant burning molten gold. The ancient stones of the keep seemed to sigh in relief, recognizing the signature of the Sunborn magic that had finally arrived to heal their frozen king. Seren shifted in her sleep, her brow furrowing slightly as a residual phantom ache from her severed past brushed against her subconscious mind. She let out a soft, distressed whimper, her slender fingers curling tightly into the thick, dark fur. Instantly, Kalin leaned forward. The terrifying warlord moved with the agonizing, deliberate caution of a man handling spun glass. He lowered his massive frame to the floor of the cabin, resting on one knee beside her bench, so that he was positioned physically lower than her, offering an unspoken posture of absolute submission. He did not crowd her space, but he deliberately projected a heavy, overwhelming wave of deep, protective alpha calm across the few inches separating them. "I am here, Seren," Kalin whispered into the quiet shadows, his golden eyes locked fiercely onto her troubled face. "The South is dead to you now. You are finally safe, and I will burn down the world before I let anyone make you feel small again." The rhythmic, heavy grinding of the iron-banded wheels has finally ceased. Seren awoke with a sharp intake of breath, her storm-grey eyes darting around the dim, amber-lit interior of the carriage. The howling fury of the winter blizzard had been replaced by a vast, echoing stillness. For a terrifying, disorienting second, her mind dragged her back to the Moon Temple. She braced herself for the sneers of the elite gallery, instinctively curling her shoulders inward to protect her vulnerable chest. But the brutal, concussive ache of the severed fated mate bond was no longer a gaping, bleeding wound. It was a dull, distant phantom ache, completely overridden by the heavy, thrumming warmth of the volcanic glass resting on her left hand. The thick iron door of the transport swung open, letting in a rush of crisp, impossibly clean mountain air. It did not smell like the cloying gardenia of her replacement, nor the stagnant, oppressive incense of the southern altar. It smelled of ancient pine, crushed ice, and the raw, electric ozone of northern magic. Kalin Valerius stepped out first, his massive obsidian boots crunching softly against the packed snow of the inner courtyard. He did not bark a command for her to hurry. He did not expect her to scramble out, like a lowly servant, eager to please her master. The terrifying warlord simply turned, his broad shoulders framing the massive archway of his fortress, and offered his battle-scarred hand to the fragile girl, still huddled in his direwolf furs. Seren hesitated, her breath plumbing in the cold air. She looked past his armored arm to take in the sheer, staggering magnitude of the legendary northern stronghold. The fortress was a primordial architectural marvel, carved directly into the jagged, living black rock of a glacial mountain. Colossal pillars of polished obsidian reached up toward a sky choked with swirling grey snow, while heavy iron portcullises looked strong enough to repel a dragon siege. It was a kingdom of monsters, a brutal, unforgiving sanctuary designed to withstand the end of the world. And yet, as her small, trembling fingers placed themselves into Kalin's massive palm, the entire imposing structure seemed to collectively exhale. As she stepped down from the carriage, the thick layer of ancient permafrost beneath her bare feet did not bite into her skin. The dormant, celestial fire buried deep beneath her ribs released a quiet, rhythmic pulse of golden heat that bled instantly through her soles and into the glacial rock. The heavy iron torches lining the massive courtyard, which had burned with a freezing magical blue fire since the dawn of the Northern Dynasty, flared wildly. In perfect cascading sequence, the blue flames inverted, shifting into a brilliant, roaring molten gold that cast a warm, honeyed glow across the dark stone. Hundreds of elite northern warriors, clad in heavy furs and spiked leather, lined the vast courtyard. These were the legendary, bloodthirsty feral wolves of the north, the nightmares the southern elders used to frighten unruly pups. Seren instinctively shrank back against Kalin's side, expecting the mocking laughter, the cruel whispers about her defective wolf, the immediate assignment to the scullery to wash the blood from their armor. Instead, an absolute, deafening silence fell over the heavily armed legion. In perfect, terrifying unison, every single warrior in the courtyard dropped heavily to one knee. The synchronized crash of their armored knee plates hitting the stone echoed like a thunderclap off the obsidian walls. They bowed their heads, exposing their vulnerable necks to the quiet, discarded Omega in a display of absolute, unquestioning reverence. They were not bowing to the beast of the north out of fear. They were bowing to the golden light radiating from her skin, welcoming the divine warmth they had desperately craved for 100 generations. From the front of the kneeling ranks, an older woman stepped forward. Gwenna Miller did not wear the rigid, ostentatious silks of the southern court. The northern healer was wrapped in practical, thick woolen garments and a heavy mantle of snow fox fur, her face lined with the deep, beautiful maps of a life spent surviving the harshest winters. Her sharp, intelligent eyes, a pale ice blue, locked onto the fragile girl clinging to their king. She saw the heavy, dark weight of the forged northern seal on the girl's finger, and the radiant, impossible heat melting the frost from the courtyard stones. "Welcome home, my Empress," Gwenna murmured, her voice carrying a deep maternal warmth that hit Seren with the force of a physical blow. The older woman sank into a deep, respectful curtsy, her gaze entirely devoid of the toxic, calculated ambition that had poisoned every interaction the girl had ever known. "The Citadel has wept for the sun for 3 centuries. We have lost too many pups to the biting frost. We are honored to finally bask in your light." Seren's throat tightened, the sheer, overwhelming reality of the supreme status reversal threatened to crush her completely. She had spent her entire morning scrubbing ash from a cold stone hearth, preparing for a public rejection she knew in her bones was coming. She had expected to die in the snow. She had never, not even in her most foolish, desperate dreams, imagined a world where highly decorated warriors would bow to her, or where an esteemed healer would call her Empress. Kalin gently guided her forward, his massive frame shielding her from the biting wind as they moved through the grand, cavernous halls of the fortress. The interior of the keep was a stark contrast to its brutal exterior. The floors were lined with thick, plush pelts, and the high vaulted ceilings were painted with ancient faded murals of wolves chasing celestial bodies. Gwenna walked softly beside them, her presence a steady, grounding anchor in the surreal environment. The healer did not ask invasive questions about her past. She did not demand to inspect the dead, hollow scar on the Omega's wrist. She simply led them up a wide, sweeping staircase carved from dark marble, directly to the royal wing of the Citadel. When Gwenna pushed open the heavy double doors of the sovereign suite, Seren physically stopped in her tracks. The room was massive, opulent, and breathtakingly beautiful. A colossal hearth dominated the far wall, roaring with a massive fire that smelled of sweet cedar and dried apple wood. The bed was a sprawling ocean of deep crimson velvet and white furs, large enough to easily accommodate a fully shifted direwolf. Floor-to-ceiling arched windows overlooked the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the mountain range, offering a view of absolute, untouchable isolation. It was a haven built specifically to protect something precious. "The baths have been drawn, and fresh garments are waiting," Gwenna said softly, stepping into the room to draw a heavy velvet curtain against the draught. The older woman turned back, her eyes catching the faint, shimmering glow of the solar spark core pulsing beneath the girl's skin. "If there is anything you require, any food, any remedy, you have only to whisper it. The entire staff answers to you, and only to you. You will never lift a scrub brush in this keep, child. That life is over." Seren looked down at her own hands. Her fingertips were still rough, stained with soot and colloosed from years of unacknowledged back-breaking labor. She traced the smooth edge of the volcanic glass ring, the irony of her situation settling heavily into her chest. She had been cast out because she was deemed too weak, too low status, too defective to stand beside a southern king. Now she was standing in the most secure, luxurious sanctuary in the world, holding the absolute command of an empire that could crush her former pack in a single night. "I don't know how to be this," Seren whispered, the admission slipping past her lips before she could stop it. Her storm-grey eyes filled with a sudden, overwhelming vulnerability as she looked at the healer. "I don't know how to be a Luna. I only know how to mend torn cloaks, brew feverweed, and remain invisible so the alphas do not notice me." Gwenna's expression softened into an expression of pure, unadulterated compassion. The northern woman stepped forward, completely ignoring the strict protocols of rank, and gently took the girl's bruised, calloused hands into her own warm grasp. "A kingdom does not need another politician in silk, little one," Gwenna replied firmly, her thumb brushing over the scarred knuckles. "We have enough warriors. We have enough teeth. What this frozen world needs is exactly what you are. Someone who knows how to mend what is torn, someone who knows how to heal." The healer bowed her head one last time. "Rest now. You are safe here, I swear it on the ice." As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the departing healer, Seren was left alone in the massive suite with the terrifying sovereign who had claimed her. The silence between them was not the oppressive, suffocating tension of the Moon Temple. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, thick with the scent of wild honey and ancient magic. Kalin stood near the roaring hearth, his broad back to the flames. The lethal warlord looked entirely out of place in the soft, luxurious room, his battle-scarred armor still dripping with the melted remnants of the blizzard. Seren didn't know that the man standing in the doorway had buried 3 women who dared to love him. She didn't know about the ancient, multi-generational curse that had frozen the hearts of every northern king, punishing any verbal intimacy with a lethal creeping frost. She only knew that the colossal predator watching her from across the room possessed eyes that held no cruelty, only a deep, agonizingly patient devotion. Kalin slowly unbuckled his heavy obsidian sword belt, letting the massive weapon clatter against the stone floor. The sound made her flinch instinctively, a conditioned response to the sudden, violent anger of southern alphas. But Kalin immediately froze. He saw the microscopic tightening of her shoulders, the way her breath hitched in her throat. Slowly, deliberately, he kicked the weapon away from him, sliding it under a heavy oak table, completely disarming himself in her presence. "I will not hurt you," Kalin stated, his voice a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the keep. He did not step closer. He remained near the fire, keeping a vast expanse of plush rugs between them. "I know what you are expecting. You were raised in a court of vipers, taught that power is synonymous with pain, that an alpha's claim is a demand for submission. But I am not Draven Thornwood." He spoke the Southern King's name with a venomous, absolute disgust that made the shadows in the room writhe. The air pressure dropped slightly as Kalin's beast flared, enraged by the mere memory of the man who had dared to throw the moon ring at her feet. But the Northern Sovereign instantly reigned in his feral magic, refusing to let his anger contaminate her sanctuary. He forced his massive shoulders to drop, deliberately projecting a wave of protective calm into the space between them. "The serving girl has been staring at me since we arrived," Kalin said, his tone dripping with amusement, abruptly breaking the heavy tension. He gestured vaguely toward the corridor outside, where a young maid had indeed lingered far too long. Her eyes wide with shock at the sight of the melted frost on his armor. "They are not used to seeing me without a layer of ice choking my throat. They are not used to seeing the fortress breathe." Seren looked toward the arched windows. It was true. The thick, perpetual layers of jagged frost that usually obscured the glass were weeping, melting into clear streams of water that pooled on the stone sills. The ambient, restorative heat radiating from her solar spark core was passively healing the environment. The room was incredibly warm, entirely defying the lethal blizzard raging just outside the walls. Her quiet resilience, the magic she had hidden for so long just to survive, was actively reviving an entire kingdom. She looked back at Kalin, the fearsome beast, the warlord who commanded tens of thousands of feral killers, was standing in the corner of the room, intentionally making himself as small and unthreatening as his massive frame allowed. He was a monster to the rest of the world, a nightmare painted in blood and ash. But as she stared into his burning, molten gold eyes, a profound, unshakable realization settled over her shattered heart. Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children. Because monsters do not search for a year. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do. "You placed your ring on my finger," Seren murmured, her voice steadying as she raised her left hand, letting the dark volcanic glass catch the firelight. "You claimed me before the ancestors. In the south, an alpha takes his rights immediately after the ceremony. They do not wait. They do not ask. They treat their lunus as property to secure their bloodlines." Kalin's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking along his scarred cheek. He closed the distance between them with slow, measured steps, stopping exactly 1 pace away. He was close enough that she could feel the immense, radiant heat of his body, close enough to smell the deep, intoxicating scent of pine and dark leather, but he kept his hands firmly at his sides. He would not take what was not freely given. "I do not follow Southern law," Kalin rasped, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with a raw, undeniable ache. "I claimed you to protect you. I placed my seal on your hand, so that the magic of the earth would know you belong to the throne, so that the devastating backlash of your rejection would fall squarely on the fool who cast you out. Right now, Draven is choking on his own arrogance. The frost he wished upon you is currently devouring his pack. But you will not look back at the ashes of his ruin." He slowly lowered himself, dropping heavily to one knee on the plush rug, exactly as he had done in the ruined temple. The supreme ruler of the northern continent, kneeling at the feet of a discarded servant. "I will not rush this bond," Kalin vowed, his golden eyes burning with absolute transparent sincerity as he looked up at her. "The hollow mark on your wrist was inflicted by a coward who wanted to control you. I want you to be free. You can have separate chambers. You can have the entire eastern wing. You never have to share my bed, Seren. I will provide your food, your clothes, your absolute safety, and I will demand nothing in return. The sheer magnitude of his restraint, the complete absence of coercion, hit her harder than Draven's rejection ever could. For her entire life, her worth had been entirely transactional. She was useful because she could clean. She was useful because she could brew medicine. She was briefly useful to an Alpha King, because her fated bloodline promised a political advantage, right up until a wealthier mistress offered a better one. But this terrifying, scarred king wanted nothing from her. He only wanted her to exist. Why? She breathed, a single treacherous tear finally breaking free and sliding down her pale cheek. The tear did not fall from grief over her past. It fell from the overwhelming, terrifying relief of her present. Why are you doing this? Kalin reached up, his massive armored hand, capable of crushing a man's skull with a single squeeze, trembled violently as his rough thumb gently caught the tear before it could drop. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark contrast to his lethal nature. Because the hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be, he murmured, quoting the very thought that had haunted her on the altar. Draven created a void. I intend to spend the rest of my life filling it with warmth. As his rough skin brushed her cheek, she finally, completely, unlocked the full magnitude of her innate Sunborn power. It was a massive, involuntary surge of divine magic. A blinding wave of golden light pulsed from her chest, washing over the kneeling king. The last remaining crystals of magical ice, clinging to Kalin's dark hair, evaporated instantly in a hiss of steam. The excruciating, bone-deep cold that had tortured his veins for a lifetime was completely, utterly banished. For the first time in his cursed existence, the Alpha King of the North felt completely, perfectly warm. Seren did not pull away. She allowed her hand to fall, her small fingers naturally coming to rest on his broad, armored shoulder. The physical connection did not burn with the frantic, desperate urgency of her previous bond. It felt like deep, unshakable bedrock. It felt like absolute sanctuary. Outside, the frozen world continued to howl, entirely unaware that the discarded Omega they had left to die had just begun to thaw the most impenetrable kingdom on Earth. Time moved entirely differently in the sanctuary of the North. 7 full months had passed since the brutal, concussive echo of the moon ring hitting the granite floor of the southern temple. In the span of those quiet, domestic months, an impossible metamorphosis had taken root. The Frost Citadel, a primordial fortress carved directly from jagged obsidian and ancient ice, had fundamentally altered its nature. The perpetual, howling blizzards that had isolated the colossal kingdom for 3 centuries had broken, surrendering to a profound atmospheric shift. The vast, iron-gated courtyard was now entirely unrecognizable. The heavy, unforgiving layers of permafrost had melted, giving way to rich, dark, fertile soil. Shimmering sun lilies bloomed violently against the dark stone walls, their petals radiating a literal physical warmth. The heavy iron torches lining the keep still burned, not with the freezing blue magic of a dying dynasty, but with the warm, honeyed light of the solar spark core. The massive, silver-furred direwolves now sprawled lazily in the courtyards, exposing their bellies to the restorative sun. Seren Vantrell stood on the high, sweeping balconies of the sovereign suite, her unblemished hands resting gently on the sun-warmed obsidian railing. She was no longer the fragile, shivering Omega draped in a thin ceremonial gown. She wore a heavy, exquisite dress of deep forest green silk, lined with the softest white fox fur. The crescent-claiming mark on her wrist, once a source of agonizing vulnerability, remained a smooth, faded white scar, completely powerless and entirely forgotten. Instead, the heavy, thrumming weight of the obsidian crest ring on her left hand anchored her to the absolute safety of her present. Beneath her ribs, the divine golden fire of her Sunborn lineage pulsed in a steady, protective rhythm, singing a beautiful dual heartbeat. She rested one colloosed hand over the prominent, undeniable swell of her stomach. She was heavily pregnant with the fated heir of the North, a child conceived in absolute freedom. A tiny, fluttering spark of golden solar heat danced flawlessly inside her womb with the cool, ancient resonance of northern ice. Kalin Valerius stepped onto the balcony behind her. The colossal, lethal warlord moved with a terrifying silence, but Seren did not flinch. She leaned back instinctively, allowing his broad, heavily armored chest to become her solid, impenetrable wall. Kalin wrapped his thick, muscular arms around her waist. The perpetual layers of magical frost that had once tortured his veins were completely, permanently banished. He was a creature of absolute warmth now. His violent storm-grey eyes permanently shifted to a deep, burning, molten gold whenever he looked at her. "The Southern King's army has reached the Frost Pass," Kalin murmured, his low, cavernous voice vibrating pleasantly against her spine. There was no feral rage in his tone, no threatened alpha posturing. There was only a cold, clinical readiness. "My scouts report a desperate, starving force dragging themselves through the heavy slush. They intend to breach the border. Draven is commanding a final march, demanding the return of his Luna." Seren's breath plumed softly in the crisp, clean mountain air. 7 months ago, the mere mention of Draven Thornwood's name would have sent her fragile nervous system into a blinding, panicked spiral. But as she stood in the radiant warmth of her own sovereign magic, securely wrapped in the arms of the most powerful beast in 3 realms, she felt absolutely nothing for the man who had thrown her away. The spiritual void Draven had created had been entirely, perfectly filled. "Prepare the Legion," Seren replied softly, her voice steady, carrying the quiet, untouchable authority of a true empress. "We ride out to meet them. It is time to close the southern door." The journey to the mountain gorge was swift, carried by the massive direwolves of the Northern Royal Guard. When Seren stepped out of the reinforced war carriage at the Frost Pass, the sheer scale of the tragedy was staggering. The Northern Legion had formed a terrifying, impenetrable wall of dark iron and massive obsidian shields, blocking the canyon entirely. Opposite them, the southern army of Arendor was a pathetic, shivering mass of frost-bitten soldiers. Their armor was caked in unnatural ice, their bodies trembling violently as they prepared for a desperate final clash. As the southern vanguard raised their heavy frost-bound weapons, Kalin raised a single, armored hand to halt his own forces. The beast of the north did not draw his sword. He simply stepped aside, yielding the front lines to his mate. Seren walked out into the freezing expanse between the 2 armies, the heavy silk of her forest-green gown trailing over the snow. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and finally, completely, unlocked the full magnitude of her innate Sunborn power. A blinding, concussive wave of divine golden fire erupted from beneath her ribs. It was not a destructive blast. It was a massive, expanding dome of pure radiant warmth that swept across the entire gorge. The golden light washed over the southern army in a miraculous tide, instantly melting the biting, unnatural permafrost into soft, fertile earth. The freezing slush evaporated into sweet-smelling steam, the thick, magical frost binding the southern soldiers' armor and weapons dissolved in seconds. The sudden, overwhelming relief of the warmth hit the starving men like a physical blow. Their swords and spears slipped from their trembling, thawed fingers, clattering uselessly against the wet stones. One by one, the elite soldiers of Arendor dropped to their knees in the mud. They wept in absolute awe, surrendering completely to the divine sovereignty of the woman their king had thrown away. With his army kneeling around him, the sheer reality of Draven's ruin was finally laid bare. Standing completely alone in the center of the pass was a pathetic, shattered husk of a man. Draven Thornwood, the once imposing Alpha King of Arendor, was completely unrecognizable. His massive frame had withered, consumed from the inside out by the terminal, somatic necrosis of the severed fated mate bond. The boiled leather armor he wore hung loosely from his gaunt shoulders. His skin was mottled with a sickly, bruised violet, the physical manifestation of the creeping frost that had devoured his kingdom. The hollow mark on his wrist had turned gangrenous with magical rot, the dark veins mapping a tragic path of spiritual starvation up his neck. His inner wolf, once a ferocious predator that commanded absolute authority, was entirely broken, emanating only the pitiful stench of a dying animal. Draven had lost everything, stripped down to the fatal consequence of his own catastrophic arrogance. Draven looked around at his surrendered army, and then his crazed, sunken eyes widened in pure shock as they locked onto the breathtaking, radiant figure standing before him. Seren did not look like the invisible, defective servant he had cast out. She was bathed in a shimmering, honeyed light, completely surrounded by the overwhelming, protective presence of the rival Lycan King. Draven collapsed heavily into the slush, scrambling forward on his hands and knees. "Seren!" Draven's voice was a ragged, wet gasp, tearing painfully from his frost-scarred throat. He crawled toward her boots, his bare, blackened fingers clawing pathetically at the melting snow. "Seren, please! The ancestors have punished me. Arundor is dying. The frost has taken the temple, the crops, the pups." He reached a trembling, frost-bitten hand into the folds of his ruined tunic, frantically pulling out a small, dull object. It was the moon ring. The sacred silver band that he had so callously dropped at her feet 7 months ago now looked like a cheap, worthless trinket. He held it up toward her, his fingers bleeding sluggishly from the cold, tears of pure physical agony freezing into jagged icicles against his jaw. "I was wrong," Draven screamed, the sound echoing pathetically across the vast valley. "Maria was a parasite. She abandoned the pack when the freeze began. You are the true Luna. The moon demands your return. Please, I will cast out the entire court. I will give you the highest seat. I am your fated mate. You belong to me, the absolute." Devastating, dramatic irony of his plea hung heavily in the crisp air. He was offering her the highest seat in a dead, frozen wasteland, completely blind to the fact that she was currently wearing the supreme volcanic glass of the largest empire in the world. Seren looked down at the desperate, weeping Alpha. She had once believed that Draven's acceptance was the only thing standing between her and death. But watching him grovel in the mud, begging for a fraction of the light he had tried to extinguish, the final shadow of her trauma evaporated completely. The physical sensation of the broken fated mate bond had once felt like a jagged blade, but now she realized the severance was a miraculous divine rescue. She felt no pity, no lingering attachment, and absolutely no desire for revenge. She simply felt the profound, untouchable peace of a woman who had completely outgrown the room she was once locked inside. Kalin Valerius did not roar. He did not need to project his massive, lethal alpha aura to intimidate the broken king. The beast of the north simply stood beside his empress, his colossal frame radiating a heavy, unshakable stillness. His golden eyes locked onto the pathetic southern ruler with the absolute apathy one reserved for a crushed insect. Seren did not raise her voice to a scream. The ambient, passive resonance of her solar spark core carried her words with perfect, crystal clarity through the mountain pass, delivering the quiet, absolute authority of a sovereign passing a final judgment. "You are mistaken, Draven," Seren said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of emotional hysteria. "I do not belong to you. I never did. The girl you were looking for, the quiet, defective Omega, who kept her head bowed and accepted your scraps, is dead. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and she took the last of your warmth with her. The moon decreed it," Draven sobbed, his forehead collapsing against the wet earth. "You cannot defy the fated bond. I am dying, Seren. The void is eating my soul." "You created the void," Seren replied flatly, the heavy weight of her truth echoing across the vast gorge. "You chose a political alliance over the soul the ancestors gave you. You threw the moon ring at my feet because you required a wolf of purebred strength. Now you must live in the kingdom you built." She raised her left hand, allowing the dark, heavy weight of the obsidian crest ring to catch the golden sunlight, flashing a blinding reflection directly into Draven's sunken eyes. I am Seren Valerius, Empress of the Northern Wastes, vessel of the Sunborn lineage. I am the mother of the Northern heir. She let the words sink in, watching the realization physically crush the last breath from Draven's lungs. And you are nothing but a fading footnote in my story. Draven's mouth opened in a silent, agonizing scream. The absolute finality of her dismissal snapped the final thread of his sanity. The Southern Alpha collapsed entirely into the slush, his body convulsing violently as the terminal frost completely overtook his nervous system. The sacred silver band slipped from his blackened fingers, burying itself in the mud, permanently discarded. Kalin stepped forward, his massive shoulder brushing reassuringly against hers. "Take this filth away from my borders," the Northern Sovereign commanded, his voice a low, cavernous rumble that vibrated through the bedrock. "Drag him back to the edge of the neutral territories. Let the blizzard claim what is left of his arrogance. If he or any wolf of Aranda ever sets foot in the north again, I will slaughter them all." The massive, iron-clad guards of the Frost Citadel moved with brutal efficiency. They dragged Draven Thornwood's limp, convulsing body away from the pass. The unarmed southern soldiers parted in terrified silence to let them through. The desperate, weeping pleas of the former king faded into the howling wind, carrying the final death rattle of the Arandor dynasty out into the unforgiving wilderness. Seren turned her back on the edge of the pass, stepping seamlessly into the protective warmth of Kalin's arms. He wrapped his thick, direwolf cloak around her, breathing in the divine scent of wild honey and ancient solar fire. "It is over," Kalin murmured, his golden eyes softening completely. "The South is truly dead. Let the kingdom burn if it must," Seren whispered, resting her cheek against the heavy, warm metal of his obsidian armor. "For my throne is wherever you stand." 5 months later, the Frost Citadel celebrated a dawn unlike any other in its brutal history. The formal coronation of the Supreme Empress of the United Northern Territories coincided perfectly with the arrival of the spring equinox. The vast, sweeping gardens of the inner courtyard were in full, miraculous bloom. The heavy, dark obsidian walls were draped in vibrant banners of gold and silver. The air was thick with the scent of blooming sunlilies and the rich, earthy aroma of thawed soil. Sen sat on a magnificent throne carved from ancient, sun-warmed cedar, placed directly beside Kalin's massive iron seat on the high dais. She wore a simple, elegant gown of spun gold, her dark hair adorned with a delicate, woven crown of living flowers, but the true crown jewel of the empire rested safely, perfectly secured in her arms. She looked down at the tiny, perfect bundle wrapped in pristine white direwolf fur. The fated heir of the north was a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark, silken hair and eyes that already promised to burn with his father's molten gold. He possessed the unmistakable aura of the primordial northern magic, flawlessly balanced by the passive, radiant heat of his mother's Sunborn lineage. Whenever the infant blinked, a tiny spark of golden light mixed playfully with a puff of cold, harmless frost, drawing gasps of absolute awe from the assembled court. The child was living, breathing proof that the deepest wounds could be healed. Kalin knelt beside the sun-warmed cedar throne, completely ignoring the thousands of elite warriors watching from the courtyard. The terrifying warlord, the beast who had conquered continents, gently reached out with a massive, battle-scarred finger. He allowed his newborn son to wrap a tiny, impossibly warm hand around it. A profound, overwhelming devotion radiated from the Alpha King. To the rest of the world, he was an untouchable monster. But here, bathed in the golden light of his mate, he yielded completely, joyfully, at his family's feet. Gwenna Miller stood nearby, holding a silver basin of warmed, honey-scented water for the blessing rites. The older healer's sharp blue eyes shone with unshed tears of pure joy. The ancient curse of the Northern Kings was permanently broken. The deep, Generational trauma of lethal frost had been unraveled by a quiet girl who had once been publicly discarded and told her wolf was defective. She was not defective. She was divine. Kalin leaned in, pressing a deep, lingering kiss to Seren's forehead. "Find someone who makes you want to be better," he murmured against her skin, quoting a promise he had made to himself in the dark, frozen depths of his cursed past. "Worth fighting for. You taught a monster how to love, little light. You mended the entire world." Seren smiled, leaning her head against his broad shoulder. She was enveloped in the unquestionable validation she had always deserved, the steady, glowing warmth of her claiming mark, a constant reminder of his absolute loyalty. With the Frost Citadel mended, the borders secure, and their fated heir safely born, she finally understood the true power of her quiet resilience. The biggest, loudest forces in the world could only break it with their teeth. But it was the small, silent acts of love, the stubborn refusal to let one's inner fire be extinguished, that truly had the power to mend it. She had survived the ultimate betrayal. She had outlasted the biting, lethal frost, and as she sat beside the rival Alpha King who had surrendered his entire world to her, the true Empress of the North finally knew what it meant to be home.